My name is Kelly Sittig. I'm the Executive Director at the Iowa Cancer Consortium, and I'm super pleased to have you all here today to hear from Dr. Sneha Phadke, who has spent the last semester or so doing an MPH practicum project with the Iowa Cancer Consortium. This is the third clinical trials virtual roundtable that we've had. The purpose of those is to help people who are working in different clinical trials networks or who are stakeholders in cancer clinical trials in some way in Iowa connect, share resources, share ideas, and collaborate so that we can all work together to reduce the burden of cancer. And so today, as you know, we're welcoming the Iowa Cancer Consortium's Research and Clinical Trials Work Group co-chair, Dr. Sneha Phadke, to share what she's learned during her MPH practicum here. Her project aimed to understand the clinical trial research networks throughout our state of Iowa, which clinical trials are offered and where they are offered, and to brainstorm ways to encourage collaboration and increase research participation by Iowans across the state. Dr. Phadke is an assistant professor and breast oncologist at the University of Iowa, and her research interests include population health, cancer outcomes, and clinical trials. Dr. Phadke, we will turn it over to you. Thanks for being here.
All right, thanks, Kelly. So I'm actually going to turn my video off too, and then turn it back on during the Q&A. Thank you so much for coming and being patient with us this afternoon and spending your lunch hour with me as I talk to you about what I learned over this past semester doing my practicum experience with Iowa Cancer Consortium. So for those of you who I have not been able to meet yet, I'm a breast oncologist at the University of Iowa Holden Cancer Center. I have a strong interest and passion for public health and also for improving cancer outcomes, both in my own patients at the individual level and at the population level. So this project really dovetailed nicely, combining my experiences as a cancer clinician, a clinical trial investigator, and also a student of public health. So the talk today is entitled Research Networks in Cancer Clinical Trials in Iowa, and I will be outlining what I learned about these networks and how they're opened and administered, as well as the types of clinical trials offered across the state and some of my observations about the data that I collected. So there are three main objectives for this presentation. For the first objective, we're going to be discussing challenges in clinical trial enrollment in Iowa. The second objective is to understand the landscape of cancer clinical trials in Iowa. And what I mean by that is understand them in the context of the type of trial, the trial sponsor, where the trials are offered, and in which therapeutic spaces. And then the third objective is to learn which resources are available to encourage collaboration between research networks, and then also to meet the needs of our own patients in Iowa. And I'm going to touch on which resources we do not have available and that I think may be helpful. So the Iowa Cancer Plan is an informational document that's designed to be a blueprint for cancer control efforts in Iowa. The Iowa Cancer Consortium is heavily involved in developing this plan, so I thought it was a good place to start when I was trying to come up with a concept for my MPH practicum project. There are many goals in this plan, and I would encourage you to read it if you have not, but there's goals ranging from prevention of nicotine and tobacco use to cancer screenings and promoting healthy lifestyles, all as methods of reducing cancer risk. So goal 12 of this plan is to increase awareness of and participation in cancer research, including clinical trials that are focused on cancer prevention, early detection, and treatment. So this goal aligned very well with my own clinical and research interests and takes a public health approach to evaluating the clinical trials that we have in the state. And so this is where I decided to formulate a project around this particular goal. So this is a list of the objectives that I had for my project. The first one was to create an up-to-date database of current oncology practices and board-certified oncology physicians, which I hoped would improve collaboration statewide once we knew where we had oncology clinics and who the physicians that worked at each clinic. I also listed the clinical trials available in Iowa for the 4 most common types of cancer: breast, prostate, lung, and colorectal. And then I classified them by the type of trial, the trial sponsor, and the therapeutic space, to try and understand where we might have overlap, or where we might have gaps, or just trends in the trials that we opened in Iowa. The third objective was to summarize descriptive statistics on breast, lung, prostate, and colorectal cancer. For the sake of time, I did not include these statistics in my presentation today, but they're easily accessible through the Iowa Cancer Registry's data tool on their website. So if you are interested in finding out about cancer statistics in your region, I would definitely recommend checking out that data tool. It's really easy to use. There's a lot of information about many different cancer types. And then I wanted to include this objective because I thought it was important to have an idea of sort of the scope of the problem for these 4 cancer types, so that I could then view the clinical trials data through the lens of public health and through epidemiology. The final objective was to discuss observations from the data that I collected for the above objectives, primarily the data that I looked at on clinical trials. So you've already heard a little bit about me, but I'm a breast oncologist at Holden Cancer Center. I'm a Midwest girl. I'm from Kansas City, and then did my fellowship at the University of Iowa. So I've been here for about 7 years, and on faculty for about 4 years. And as Kelly said, my research interests are kind of varied. I am interested in population health, cancer outcomes, supportive cancer care, and also therapeutic clinical trials. And just as a plug, I'm just sort of a nerd about public health and cancer epidemiology. So if you ever have any ideas for projects or things you're working on, I'd love to hear more about your ideas and what's going around on, in your region of the state. So feel free to contact me about any of that kind of stuff. So the first section of this talk is going to address that first objective for this presentation, which is challenges in clinical trial enrollment. I tried to curate this into a list of items from the literature on this topic, which there's quite a bit of literature on this topic, and then also my own experiences as a clinical trial investigator. So we live in a rural state. That can lead to barriers for some patients who want to enroll in a clinical trial, especially if they have a long distance to travel to the clinical trial site. We actually have 12 clinical trial sites in our state, which is awesome for a smaller rural state. However, it's not just having a site within a reasonable distance, it's having a trial at that site that the patient's clinical situation fits. And we'll get into what I mean by that a little bit later on when we talk about therapeutic spaces and eligibility criteria. But going along with the travel distance is the potential financial strain that clinical trials can have on a patient and their family. So this could include lost wages from needing to take time off work, money needed for gas or hotel stays if they're having to stay overnight, needing a driver if the investigational agent requires that they have a driver, maybe their family member or friend has to take time off. So, and then this can be compounded by the frequency of visits that the trial requires compared to the standard of care. As a clinical investigator, I have heard comments from some patients about, in Iowa, about concerns about driving in winter weather, especially if they have to traverse some hazardous terrain. Some of my older patients don't feel comfortable driving in the dark. And as we all know, in the fall and winter, nightfall starts at, like 4:45. And so this can be a barrier to a patient wanting to enroll on a trial. I wanted to get into financial toxicity and just delve into that a little bit more, because I think it's an important aspect of clinical trial challenges. So the effects of financial toxicity can be found throughout the cancer care continuum. And there's 3 main types of financial toxicities. There's direct medical costs, which are the costs of medications, infusions, appointments, imaging, the cost of the actual medical care. Then there's direct non-medical or ancillary costs. And these are things like transportation, childcare, if they need to pay someone, to watch their child, if they're, they need to pay someone, to watch an elderly parent that they're caring for, that sort of thing. Then there's indirect costs, like not being at work resulting in lower or lost wages. So a few years ago, ASCO, which is our professional organization, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, assembled a roundtable on addressing these financial barriers to clinical trials. And Dr. Karen Wingfield, who is one of the co-chairs, said this about financial toxicity. Enrollment in clinical trials may add to these ancillary expenses of cancer care if more frequent monitoring is required to assess efficacy or ensure patient safety while on the study. Although the financial toxicity of cancer care is being discussed, integral costs above standard care that clinical trial participants are exposed to may create a barrier that prevents some from enrolling. So this is a really important aspect of counseling patients on clinical trials that needs to be addressed to see if this is a reason that a patient may decline to enroll. So this roundtable came up with 3 recommendations. The first recommendation was to improve payer clinical trial coverage policies. So essentially improving insurance coverage for trial costs that are not covered by the trial sponsors. They also recommended that clinical trial costs should be consistent, streamlined, and transparent. I will say that, you know, these recommendations came out a couple of years ago, and in that time, insurance companies have improved their payments for clinical trials, but some insurance companies have restrictions, so they'll only pay for phase 3 clinical trials, but not phase 1 or 2, for example, which can be quite limiting. The second recommendation is that during clinical trial development and the enrollment process, patients should be provided with clear information about their own out-of-pocket costs, including mechanisms to support patient financial and health literacy. And then the third recommendation was to remove impediments to ethically appropriate financial compensation for trial-related out-of-pocket costs. So this should not be considered undue inducement. So this is referring to compensating patients for the indirect cost of participating in a trial, such as childcare, lost wages, and transportation costs. I think historically there's been some concern about whether this would financially incentivize someone to participate in a trial, which is why it may be tricky to have IRB approval for that kind of compensation. But, you know, I think that in the last few years, this has really improved in my experience, and it seems to become more standard now where these indirect medical costs are now compensated. The next challenge I want to discuss is related to standard of care therapies. So here there are 2 main issues, and I've personally encountered both of them. So the first one is that the standard of care is rapidly evolving. So trials can take a long time to open, from the first concept of a clinical trial all the way through writing a protocol, getting funding, approval from all the committees, including IRB, and then finally being able to actually open and enroll. This process can take up to a year, sometimes more than that. And as an investigator, while we try to anticipate what the standard of care will be when the trial is open, we can't always accurately predict that. And so if the standard of care has changed during that time, and that is part of the design of the trial, it can be hard to enroll patients, and the trial may actually need to be revised. Fortunately, we also have some very excellent standard of care options. So for many of my patients who have early stage breast cancer, they do very well with standard of care therapy. So we really should be very deliberate in choosing trials that we think will fit our patient population and that we think have the greatest chance of benefiting our patients. So for some of my patients with breast cancer, this may actually be trials that are investigating de-escalation therapies to avoid over-treating patients who will do well with less treatment. And that sort of brings us to the next challenge of cancer stage, cancer subtypes, and therapeutic spaces. So fortunately, most patients in Iowa with breast cancer present with either stage 0 or stage 1 disease at diagnosis. So this is great, but many trials don't enroll these patients because they do so well with standard of care therapy. But some patients with early stage disease will relapse. It's really difficult to estimate how many patients we have that relapse to stage 4 breast cancer or stage 4 cancer, where clinical trials then might be a really good option for them. If your own clinic has its own registry that it keeps on patients to know how many patients recur or relapse, then that is a very useful tool to use in choosing which trials you want to open. But if you don't have that sort of registry or that sort of data, it can be difficult to know, what is the patient population that is in the greatest need. So it's also, subtypes are another potential challenge. Some trials are only open to patients with certain subtypes to include things like the status of some receptors like estrogen receptor, progesterone receptor, tumor mutations. So the tumor has to have a certain mutation in order for the patient to go on a trial, or the histology of the tumor. And these are just a few examples of many different types of subtypes. So depending on the frequency of the subtype, each trial may only be able to enroll a few patients at a given site. And so we'll need to have a multitude of sites, potentially internationally, to enroll an adequate number of patients. And then lastly, I made this table at the bottom to just show for breast cancer what the different therapeutic spaces are where trials fit. And so for any given patient, he or she would really only fit into one, maybe two of these spaces. Again, just underscoring the need to really thoughtfully choose which trials to pursue, which is something that as an investigator over the last 4 years, I've definitely become more adept at doing. One of the final challenges I wanted to go over was that of eligibility criteria. So some criteria can be quite restrictive. That will result in a large number of patients being ineligible, which can slow accrual to the trial, risk losing generalizability of the results, and then limiting the understanding of the intervention's benefit to risk profile. So in 2017, an article was published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, which was a joint recommendation from ASCO, Friends of Cancer Research, and the US FDA, asking researchers and stakeholders to consider modernizing these criteria that had been routinely used in cancer clinical trials. So the particular criteria of interest are listed here. They are brain metastasis, prior or concurrent malignancy, minimum age, HIV infection, and organ dysfunction. So I think more recently, clinical trials have adopted these recommendations and have loosened some of these restrictions, such as allowing patients with stable treated brain metastasis to enroll on cancer trials, or allowing those with a history of an in situ cancer and a low risk of recurrence enroll. Similarly, if a trial is applicable, say, to adolescents, the committee recommended not choosing an age of 18 as an arbitrary age cutoff. And if the patient has well-controlled HIV infection, I've now seen that more protocols allow those patients to participate. And then lastly, protocols are now recommended to consider loosening the strict criteria around lab parameters, such as kidney function and liver function, to allow for a more representative population of patients to enroll. So I think looking forward, a lot of these have been incorporated into more recent protocols. And I think looking forward, loosening these criteria will help increase participation in trials. There are still some common comorbidities that may exclude patients, like heart disease, diabetes, or neuropathy. And I think that we just have to look at those protocols individually to see if they would restrict a large number of the patients that we see in clinic. So the last part of this section on challenges in enrollment is going to go over a couple of studies that I found interesting on how to predict if a clinical trial will be at risk for low or slow accrual. So this study is from MD Anderson, and it was an analysis of all the clinical trials, phase 1 to 3, with a maximum projected accrual of at least 10, and were active from 1981 to 2011. The primary outcome was slow accrual, which they defined as fewer than 2 subjects accrued per year. And then they looked at the trial characteristics or trial factors and their associations with slow accrual. So they found that of the 4,269 trials that met criteria for inclusion, 18% were, sorry, I'm trying to move my little Zoom box here. 18% were slow accruing, including 394 or 9% that actually accrued 0 patients. And then multivariable analysis revealed that cooperative group trials were associated with slow accrual. Similarly, the longer it took from trial activation to first enrollment, the higher the chance that it would be a slow accruing trial. On the other hand, if the trial had a large projected targeted accrual, so if they projected that they were going to accrue a lot of patients, this was associated with a lower risk of a trial being a slow accruer. So you can see in these graphs how the trials are broken down by phase and the trial sponsor, and the percentage of slow accruing trials is in the top part in black. Phase 2 and 3 trials had a higher proportion that were slow accruing compared to phase 1. And then on the bottom, you can see the sponsor of the trial, and they only offered, they didn't offer as many national cooperative group trials at MD Anderson, but about half of them were slow accruing. The other types of trials had, industry and externally peer reviewed, et cetera. They had a lower proportion that were slow accruing. So we'll go back and talk a little bit about this. I'd definitely be interested in hearing everyone's thoughts on this, who were involved in opening and administering cooperative group trials. We certainly have many here at the university as well, and so I have some experience with this also. This is another trial that looked at cooperative group trials specifically through the NCI. So the aim of this study was to identify trial level factors that influenced accrual. So they identified 787 trials that met criteria for low accrual, and that was defined as trials that closed with or were accruing at less than 50% of the target. So they found that 18% of NCTN sponsored trials closed with low accrual or were accruing at less than half of the target at least 3 years after initiation. We broke the risk factors down into 3 groups. The first group was background or disease-related factors. So they found that having high competition was associated with low accrual. So this means having trials that competed with the trial in question in the same geographic area. Low accruing trials were also more likely to be studying a more rare cancer and thus required a larger enrollment fraction. They also identified some treatment-related factors associated with low accrual and found that low accruing trials were less likely to be studying a new investigational agent or a targeted therapy. Stated inversely, a trial that was investigating a new drug or targeted therapy was sort of protective against low accrual. Low accruing trials were more likely to be evaluating multimodality therapy, surgery, or radiation. And then when thinking about the design of the trials themselves, the investigators found that more burdensome eligibility criteria, the need for a tissue or biopsy sample, and randomized design were all associated with lower accrual. So this is their logistic regression model that predicted for a low accruing trial. And you can see that phase 3 versus phase 2, higher risk of or higher odds of a low accruing trial, and then also having a common solid cancer. So the ones that I specifically looked at in my project, prostate, breast, lung, and colon, had a higher odds of having low accrual versus liquid or rare solid cancers. So I'm gonna move on now and talk about the second objective of my presentation, which was to discuss my own findings with respect to cancer clinical trials in Iowa. So I'm going to try to actually open this map. So I made a map of all of the clinics here. Can you guys see that?
Yep, looks great, Sneha.
So this is one of the maps, one of a few maps I made. So this is all of the different clinics in Iowa, as well as some of the outreach sites. There were a few clinics that had multiple outreach sites, such as Ames and McFarland Clinic, as well as Mission Cancer and Blood in Des Moines that had like 20+ outreach sites. So I actually put those on separate maps just to avoid clutter. And so here in these areas without any blue dots, a lot of this is actually covered by outreach sites. I actually, these Google Maps, you can ask for the link. I have a link, and I think Kelly at the consortium has a link. So if you want to review your own clinic site and make sure everything's accurate, that would be great, because I certainly want this information to be as accurate as possible. So this is a map of where clinical trials are offered. So I said before, there are 12 sites in Iowa that have clinical trials. And just to clarify that, there are, these are the main sites. So from what I could understand from the many people I talked to at these various sites, clinical trials are generally not offered at the outreach clinics, just due to logistics of administering the trial and administering the therapy, and being, you have to have, a bunch of things validated to be able to run clinical trials through outreach sites. And so there's really only offered at the main clinic sites. In the kind of southwest part or west part of Iowa, the Council Bluffs clinics, they do participate in clinical trials, through their network, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but they have to be referred over to the Omaha side to actually enroll on clinical trials. So that's why I did not include that on this map. So the next set of slides describes what I learned about the types of clinical trials that we offer in Iowa for the 4 most common cancer types. Just as some background or context, I limited my search for trials to phase 2 and 3 trials because phase 1 trials I think are only offered at the Holden Cancer Center and are often just open for short periods of time, which make them harder to track. Phase 1 trials also encompass multiple tumor types, which would have created some issues with analyzing the data by cancer type. And so these are really just limited to phase 2 and 3 trials. I do want to thank all the contacts at the clinical trial sites for answering my many emails and directing me to resources where I could find this data. It was very kind of you to be patient with me as I tried to work my way through all this. So this is a table that details the breast cancer trials in Iowa. So this means hormone positive, HER2 positive, triple negative, and this is just any receptor status can enroll. So there were 28 breast cancer clinical trials available at the time of data collection, which was about March to May of this year. One trial was for both hormone positive and triple negative, and so I put them in both spots. So there's actually 29 trials in this table. And then I also made a separate document listing what all the clinical trials were and where they're offered. And so I have kind of multiple areas with this information, but this sums up what I learned. So there were 6 radiation oncology trials. 5 of them were only offered over on the west side of Iowa in Des Moines and Ames, and the other one was at PCI in Cedar Rapids. So I thought that was just an interesting observation, and if anyone has any thoughts as to why there are not more radiation trials on the east side of the state, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. There were 4 surgical oncology trials that were offered in Iowa City, Cedar Rapids, and Des Moines, which may be related to just surgeon specialty. And then when looking at the trials in medical oncology, which are sort of in this space, there was a trial that it's the SWOG trial called S1418, and it's looking at immunotherapy for triple negative breast cancer and giving that to patients with curative intent. And that was open at almost all clinical trial sites in Iowa, which I just thought was interesting, and it probably reflects the enthusiasm for immunotherapy, and specifically in this subtype where we have some limited treatment options. And then looking at the bottom, so this is by sponsor. So we had 24 cooperative group trials, 2 investigator-initiated trials, and 2 industry trials, which were at the university. So this is the data on lung cancer. There were 27 lung cancer clinical trials available in Iowa, again, from March to May of this year. There are actually 26 studies in the table because one of the studies is called the Alchemist trial, which is sort of a master protocol, but it's really just a collection of sub-studies. And so I didn't put that on here. The most common therapeutic space for lung cancer was here in the metastatic non-small cell lung cancer space. This is the most common type of lung cancer, encompasses adenocarcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, which are most common. And unfortunately, many patients with lung cancer either present with metastatic disease or relapse. So makes sense that there would be a lot of trials in this particular space, really across the state. And then so looking down at the table at the bottom, most of the trials were cooperative group. There were a few investigator-initiated trials at the university, and then 4 industry trials, which I believe were at the university and at June Island and Sioux City. So then moving on to prostate cancer. So there were actually only 6 prostate cancer trials open across the state, which I was a bit surprised at, just considering how common prostate cancer is. So although there were only 6 trials, they were really a mix of what type of therapy was being investigated. So there were some investigating systemic therapy, others looking at radiation, and then one in the surgery setting. The there was the one radiation trial was offered in Cedar Rapids and in Ames. And then most of the other trials were either looking at castrate-resistant prostate cancer, which is definitely an area of need. And then one trial at the university was looking at biochemical relapse to try to prevent or delay onset of metastatic disease. So even though there were not very many sites that had prostate cancer trials, many of them had one particular trial in common called the CHARTED-2 trial, which I assume, I'm not a prostate cancer oncologist, but I assume that there must have been a lot of enthusiasm for the therapy that trial is investigating. And then as far as the sponsor, it's really a mix. So there's 3 cooperative group trials, and then the other half, there's 2 in industry, and then 1 investigator-initiated trial. So if anyone has any thoughts about why there are relatively few prostate cancer trials compared to the other cancers, I would definitely be interested in hearing your thoughts. It may be because many patients with prostate cancer get diagnosed with early stage disease and just have a very good outcome with standard therapy, and so that it may just not be an area of need as compared to the other cancers. Another thought I had was that maybe these are just listed somewhere else. I know that early stage prostate cancer is often managed by urology, and perhaps I was just not looking in the right place. And that brings us to the last one, colorectal cancer, last but not least. So there were 9 clinical trials available in Iowa from March to May of this year, and you can see that they were all medical oncology trials. 4 were in the neoadjuvant or adjuvant space, so this was curative intent, and then 5 were in the space of metastatic colorectal cancer. I didn't find any radiation or surgical oncology trials. I know radiation is not used as frequently in colon cancer, so that may be part of it, although it is used more often in rectal cancer. And then if you look at the sponsors, almost all were cooperative group. So if you look at all 4 of the common cancer types, the number of open trials was really weighted toward breast and lung, which had 27 or 28 trials open versus prostate and colorectal, which had 6 or 9. So that was one of the questions this data brought up for me, is how are clinical trials chosen? Who chooses them? You know, why there might be this higher weight towards certain cancers? Is it because there's a higher incidence? Is it because maybe we see more mortality from those cancers in certain areas? Maybe the PIs at certain clinics have a specialty or an interest in these cancers. And so again, I would just be interested in hearing your thoughts on that. So the last part of this talk today, which is about another 8 slides or so, focuses on the research networks in the state, as well as some of the strengths, limitations, and resources that we have in Iowa in the context of trials. So many of you on the call today may be well aware of these networks. A lot of this was new information for me. And I want to say a special thanks to Shannon Benson, who helped me understand these research networks in Iowa, because she can attest, I was confused at first. So NCORP is one of the main ways in which community oncology practices participate in clinical trials. This is the NCI Community Oncology Research Program, and it's a national network of cancer care investigators, providers, those in academia and other organizations that deliver cancer care. So IWORK is the Iowa-wide Oncology Research Coalition, and that's listed on the NCORP grant and funded by NCORP. So it's sort of our Iowa grant from NCORP. And most clinical trials through IWORK, because it's through the NCI, are federally funded or cooperative group trials, although there are some industry trials. So IWORK is the program that administers clinical trials at some community clinics in Iowa, and it's funded by NCORP. The IORA, which is the Iowa Oncology Research Association, works with a few different clinics in Iowa. So they are based in Des Moines, and they work with Mission Cancer and Blood, John Stoddard Cancer Center, and Blank Children's Hospital in Des Moines, and they're the lead site for the IWORK grant. They're housed within John Stoddard, but they're not John Stoddard employees. So the grant funds additional sites at both Mercy and Unity Point in Cedar Rapids, Jefferson County Health Center in Fairfield, and McFarland Clinic in Ames. And they work with these cooperative groups, ECOG Akron, Alliance, Energy, Wake Forest, and then Blank Children's Hospital also does children's oncology group trials. There are other NCORP networks, such as the NCORP network of Sanford of the North Central Plains, in which June E. Nyland Cancer participates in Sioux City. And then Catholic Health Initiatives, or CHI, runs trials through the Mercy system in Des Moines and in Council Bluffs. So again, patients in the Council Bluffs office are referred to sites in Omaha to actually enroll and get the investigational treatment there. And then there are other ways for community oncology practices to participate in research. So for example, Mercy One Waterloo is an affiliate of the University of Iowa and participates in energy and alliance trials through this mechanism. So the last few slides will review my observations of what I think are some of the strengths of clinical research in Iowa and some of the areas where maybe we can improve. So one of my initial impressions after gathering data on all this, all the things I've discussed today, is that I'm really quite impressed by the scope of oncology care in Iowa between the main clinic sites and all the outreach clinics. It looks like we really cover most of the state. Seems like most patients would have an oncology clinic within 30 to 60 minutes of home, whether that's a main clinic site or an outreach site. And we also have a lot of clinical trials, and I think a lot of clinical trial sites for a smaller rural state. We have some ongoing collaboration right now through the clinical trial sites, either through NCORP or other research networks like CHI. And then several sites have unique trials, whether they're industry sponsored or investigator initiated, which really broadens our ability as a state to find trials for our own people. So if a patient is not a candidate for maybe a cooperative group trial at one site, there may be options at other sites. I really appreciated how dedicated the research staff are in Iowa, the doctors, the PIs, nurses, coordinators, advocates, and others in their mission to offer clinical trials to our patients. It's a lot of work to maintain clinical trials and make sure that you're doing everything to the T and correctly. And so it definitely shows how much dedication people have. Some of the clinics that I reached out to that did not have clinical trials told me that they are trying to start administering clinical trials. And so, you know, in the future, we actually may have more sites. We also have an NCI designated cancer center in the state at the Holden that offers some industry trials and investigator initiated trials, which again, I think just gives more options to our patients and broadens what we can offer them. So right now we don't have a statewide database on open clinical trials in the state. This is something I've heard from patients and providers alike would be helpful when trying to match a patient to a trial. You know, this was one of the things that I was thinking about as I was doing this project, like how could we do this? And I'm, you know, by no means an informatics person. And so, you know, I don't have those skills per se, but I think it would likely require another organization to create and maintain that kind of a database. I think one of the difficulties with that is that since we all are using different IRBs, we can't rely on IRB approval data to automatically update the database. Like I know that we do that at the university, and maybe other places do that, but I don't think there'd be a statewide mechanism to do that. And so I think it would have to be manually updated. And then clinical trials also are changing quickly, especially phase 1 trials. And so that would be a lot of work to really make sure that the database was being maintained, you know, and it was accurate. So I don't think that all hope is lost that we would ever, you know, have this database, but I just think it would be something that would be, you know, a big undertaking, and we'd need buy-in from and collaboration from all trial sites in the state. So one of the things that I talked about initially was that cooperative group trials and phase 3 trials are hardest to accrue. I would be interested in your thoughts on this, if it's an issue that you've encountered, if you've thought of ways to overcome this, because we do offer a lot of cooperative group trials in Iowa, and maybe this isn't a problem at other community sites. I just don't know the answer, and just would appreciate your own experiences on that. Like I said, we do have a rural population, although the rural population of Iowa is a little bit different than the rural populations of other states that are often researched and in the literature, where our rural population tends to be more educated and have a higher socioeconomic status than, say, some rural populations in the southern states. And then one of the last things, and I don't know that this is a limitation as much as maybe an area to just improve on, is patient perception, also just general layperson perception of research and clinical trials, educating them on why they're important, that this is how we move cancer care forward, and, maybe having more outreach on this topic. So these last couple slides are my ideas on how to increase collaboration and some of the resources we have to that end. So I pulled data from the Iowa Cancer Registry to help with my own decisions as an investigator on which trials to open. It's a really good resource to better understand cancer patients that you see in your region and in the state as a whole. So if you find that it would be helpful to have that kind of data to guide your decisions on which trials to open, I recommend that you try their data tool online if you haven't. You can also request de-identified data that has more information in it, like more information about the type of cancers and zip codes and that sort of thing. So through this project, I created a contact list for each clinic. I have contacts for almost all clinics in the state. And this contact list, the Iowa Cancer Consortium now has it. And so if you have an idea for some collaborative effort and you want to contact a certain clinic or a certain trial site, hopefully you should be able to get that information now. Clinicaltrials.gov is a resource that I use frequently during this project to gather data on trial offerings in the state. The search function on this website can be filtered for trials by state and cancer type. Some clinics in Iowa have their trials listed on their own website, but not all clinics have this. So if you're looking for a trial at a certain site, it's also helpful to be able to have the name of a contact at that site. And then lastly, there are some patient-oriented resources. So I just found out about this More Moments, More Memories Foundation. I think it's based in Dubuque and helps to remove some of the financial obstacles that patients might face, especially as they're trying to enroll in clinical trials. And I know the American Cancer Society and Susan G. Komen have some grants for patients who need financial assistance with treatment. And I'm sure that there are many more that I didn't list here. And so if you know of any others, please go ahead and type those into the chat box so that we can all be aware of them. So this is the first time, to my knowledge, that we have one place with all the locations of the oncology clinics in the state, interactive maps where, with the locations of the clinics, names of oncology providers, clinical trial sites, and details about the research networks in the state. Again, I also have research contacts for most of the sites. And then I provided the Iowa Cancer Consortium with a toolkit for how to repeat this project in the future, because I think it'll be interesting to look for trends, to repeat this project in another couple of years and see if there's any differences in our clinical trial portfolio, or look at different cancer types, or even just, a brand new idea that is sort of in this realm somewhere. So hopefully someone in the future will be able to recreate this, and we can learn, how things are moving in the future. So at this point, we don't have any systematic collection of relapses and recurrences in the state or nationally, although I think the Iowa Cancer Registry and SEER, they're starting to collect some data on recurrence. Whether they're doing that at all sites, I don't know. So potentially in the future, we will be able to use that data to guide and inform our decisions on which clinical trials to open. In complete honesty, I'm still not sure that the data that I collected is 100% accurate. And I think it's important to bring this up only to underscore how difficult it can be to collect this data, which was surprising to me. It sort of seemed like something that should be readily available. But I actually just had to cold call some people and ask about their clinic locations and trial offerings and their research networks. And so thank you to all those people that answered the phone and talked to me. But my hope is that if there's interest among stakeholders in Iowa to improve communication and collaboration, that this project is really a starting point on how to do that. Because I know at the end of the day, we all share a common goal of trying to just provide excellent care to our state. And this is a question that came up as I was doing this project, and I sort of alluded to it earlier. But I am very interested in how clinical trials are chosen around the state. So if anyone wants to talk about that, either here or offline, I'd be really interested to know what that process is like at your site. So one of the limitations to collaboration right now is I think there is a relative lack of infrastructure to support that collaboration. I also don't exactly know, and I can't think of a way for clinical trial sites to collaborate on clinical trials, because many of the sites are actually, you know, working with the same NCORP grant, or they have many of the same trials open. So that might be a challenge to collaboration, but you know, I think gauging interest on if different people at different sites are interested in collaborating, I think that's a great place to start. Another challenge is that we haven't met in person, a lot of us, and so we just don't know who to contact or who the right person is to talk to. And then one area I think we could really improve on is doing research other than clinical trials. So right now there's no formal mechanism for knowing what research is going on around the state. I think Iowa Cancer Consortium would be a great way to potentially facilitate knowing more about that, but maybe we can collaborate on things, on research other than clinical trials. And that can be something like a prospective registry where we collect data on relapses and recurrence rates, or we collect data on the number of patients treated on clinical trials and the outcomes of those patients. One example I just wanted to share is that we have a registry that we're starting at the University of Iowa since the pandemic started, where we're going to be prospectively enrolling patients with breast cancer who have been diagnosed, you know, after about March when the pandemic started, to see if their treatment had, you know, required a change due to the pandemic. And then if there was any, you know, see what their outcomes are and to sort of compare those to historical controls or to patients whose treatment wasn't changed. So we've been able to collaborate with a couple of sites outside of the university to give us kind of a bigger patient population and a broader scope. So if anyone's interested in that registry, please contact me. We're definitely interested in getting as many patients as we can to inform our future practices. So that's all I have. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed my experience at the consortium, and just thank everyone for coming today. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, or maybe there already are questions, and Kelly, maybe you can tell me if there are questions.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Phadke. We do have a couple. So the first one, I know you mentioned some of these, but beyond what you mentioned, what are the challenges that are observed in enrolling and having patients from rural areas participate in a clinical trial?
Sorry, and the question was, what are the challenges to, what? Sorry.
What are the challenges observed in enrolling and having patients from rural areas participate in clinical trials?
So I would say that, you know, once patients from rural areas are enrolled, I don't have, you know, in my experience, there aren't as many challenges per se, other than the challenges that I mentioned, where it might be harder for them to get to clinics sometimes due to weather or something like that. One of the things I've noticed in protocols, and as I'm writing protocols, is that we're getting a little bit more flexible with that, where if a patient needs to, you know, wait 1 or 2 days to come in because of weather, you know, it's not gonna ding you, you know, as an investigator, which I think is really helpful.
Thank you. Okay, next question is from Betsy Christilis. She says she's interested in the statewide database idea. Challenges aside, do you have any advice on one step we could take towards this?
So I think the first step is gauging interest and having, you know, a meeting similar to this for people who are interested and maybe, you know, kind of stakeholders to see, you know, if there's interest doing this, because I think it's going to take buy-in and interest from people at each clinical trial site to help get that set up.
Thank you. And then Rachel asked, do you know if Medicaid patients in Iowa are eligible to enroll in clinical trials? And that was actually answered by a couple folks in the chat box. The answer is yes, but do you have anything, any remarks related to that you want to share?
Nope, I agree with the answers here. I will say I'm not sure about the phase 1 though. I think that may be an issue, yeah.
Dr. Phadke, we want to thank you so much for your time, your effort, and for sharing this great information with us. Just really appreciate you and all that you do. So thank you so much.
Thank you.